I beat Palia's new obstacle course, the tower, and I'm going to pass along some information, some tips that I learned that helped me to beat it. Hopefully, they help you too. And I'll start with some generic ones before diving into each section of the tower sequentially. So, if you want help on a specific part, or if you want my general guidance for it, you can look in those specific parts. First, the general tips, and by this I mostly mean things that you should know about the game and things to look out for before heading in. Firstly, your character has three different walk speeds, which, depending on your control scheme, can be either toggled or held to do them. You have a sprint, a middle walk, and what we refer to as an RP walk, which is really slow. I recommend using the middle walk speed over the sprint for most of the random jumps that you'll find around because they're just easier to control and aim. Although sprint is also useful in many places, especially where there are moving things to jump to or from. And we'll discuss these more as we get to them. And I never once used the RP walk. On top of sprinting, you'll also have climbing and gliding. You'll want to have already gotten the glider before this challenge, as there are some parts of it that require the glider to progress. I recommend getting used to the stamina bar and how to manipulate your character from a glide to being able to climb on a wall, just because you can't actually climb if your character is facing away from the wall, so you'll need to learn how to spin around and grab it at the last second. And those are really all the things that you need to practice before heading into the tower, but there are some odd interactions and controls that you should be aware of before really jumping in, because these are the major frustration points. The first thing I want to say, there are no checkpoints in this entire run. Instead, we'll refer to things that I will call safe points, which you need to do on your own, but will basically function as checkpoints. Some other things to be aware of. The most annoying thing in this entire run will likely be the climbing, because the climbing in Palia is generally awful. Throughout this run, you can find yourself getting stuck, not being able to finish climbing a surface or get off of it, or even glitching out of grabbing a surface and falling just because the game said so. The second thing that you want to remember is that because your jump and glider are both mapped to the same action key, you'll likely find that the game screws up which one you're doing quite a bit, especially as you're getting used to the map. And the third is that your character has a slight rotational effect when you try to turn them or try to go from pointing left to right, up to down. You'll never actually stay centered, your character will rotate, which can make repositioning your character from an edge nearly impossible at some points. It just feels real bad. So we got to keep that in mind when we're planning jumps. And lastly, there are frequent rubber bands and desyncs with the moving platforms in particular, so don't be surprised if you go to make a jump and then suddenly the thing that you were jumping to is just suddenly gone. And that's the end of the generic advice and things to keep out for. We'll now head into the sequential map run through. The beginning is fairly simple. You're going to sprint to the first obstacle, making sure to dodge these holes. Once you get to the first set of furniture, I suggest switching from sprinting over to walking, because jumping from furniture to furniture is best done slowly. You can try to follow my route here, but I made this for myself, mostly through experimenting a ton and seeing what felt comfortable for me. For your runs, I recommend trying to find a path with large tables or something that you can easily make the jumps to and that you feel comfortable with doing, but also make sure you don't have too many jumps, because the more you jump, the more likely you are to screw up. And there are two of these furniture sections back to back. I recommend using these to get used to, well, walk speed jumping from furniture to furniture, especially with the different heights of some areas. This will become very important later. Once you get through the first two furniture sections, you'll find that you can climb this wheel-looking thing, and that leads to another furniture section with spinning ruins. I do want to note that while I'm doing this part, I'm still using walk speed, but I'm also forcing myself to use the glider on several jumps to make things quite a bit easier or possible, because the strategy that I came up with for myself involved jumping to the largest objects that I could find on the right hand side. And this is just because the ruins spin counterclockwise, so if they pass to the right, then we can start running to the right, and it'll give us a lot of time. I should note that there is a single table here. It's a little bit lighter that you can stand on for a couple seconds while waiting for the second ruin to pass, but once it passes, you need to be pretty quick because the one behind you can knock you off of it. So, just like the first two sections, this is mostly walk jumping and adding your glider in. The only thing that really makes this hard is you're now basically on a time limit because the ruins are a spinning weapon. Again, this is a section that you should get used to. It will help you on later challenges if you're used to making some of these jumps with a little bit of time pressure. I also recommend standing near the beginning and looking out and seeing a path that you want to go for before jumping out. The worst thing in the world is to try to figure out where you're jumping to next while you're landing. It just eats up time. And don't be afraid to add your glider in. Now, up to this point, we've had no checkpoints. If you fall, you restart, and that's about to change. Once you're done with the ruins, you'll find that you're doing some climbing and some spinning rocks. And this is the first truly vertical section, which allows us to add this idea of save points. Basically, if we're going vertically and we fall, we can use our glider to go to places that we were at previously. What I want you to do is, while you're climbing these rocks, I want you to take some time and look around for points that you can fall to if you mess stuff up or if, for some reason, the climbing bugs out, because this is where you can start doing things like that. And remember, you only use your stamina while actively climbing. If you're not hitting the button to go up or down, you can look around all you want to try to find something. Remember, please always have a plan for what to do if you fall. That's the only thing that will make these save points really possible. Is the reason I'm marking them as save points is you know that's where you're going to, right? But you can save yourself a lot of time by finding your own little points along the way that are a little closer. Now, when it comes to the actual spinning rocks, I should note that you can jump on and off of them while they're either lying flat or standing straight up. If you only need to jump off of 2 of these in a row, lying flat is generally fine. Because they're constantly spinning, you need to jump right before they're flat to land on them. But if for some reason there's 3 or more, it gets a little bit dicey, and also the last set don't all spin in the same way. With these, it's actually possible to try to jump to land on them when they're vertical so that your next jump is going to land with them a little bit more flat, which should make it possible to get through them. Yeah, it's not the best explanation, but it works. Now we have just one more section before we're done with part 1, and that is the spinning ruins with rocks. Now, I want you to be really careful here. Map out your path, watch everything, because if you fall here, it's back to the beginning. There's no escaping the tower if you fall into it. Again, I recommend walking here, although I do have some shots of me trying to sprint, and it ends up coming out a little bit weird. So if you do want to sprint, be very careful. Just like the furniture, once it passes, run through, and if you've planned out your jumps with walking, you should be just fine. Congratulations, you've beaten part 1. Part 2 introduces some moving platforms that are terrible for many reasons. They run on a set path with set timings, so try to look around when you're going through them and finding targets that you can jump to that match, well, your current platform's timing. Also, while you're running, you may notice that if you try to land on the wooden part around the edge of the platforms, that you'll sometimes just not be able to land on them or phase through them. It sucks, but if you're trying to land on these, you really need to land on the colored part, which is either green or blue if you want a safe landing. Oh, and the desyncing is really bad for you anywhere that there's platforms, because these are what gets reset when everything breaks. So when you're going through here, generally be careful, plan your jumps, And for any moving platforms like this, I do recommend you get used to using sprint jump in these sections. It's just a lot easier to hit the middle of a platform when sprinting rather than walking. And your safety point for when you fall here is way back in part 1, that part with the rocks that we were climbing. That part we will call point A. And basically, as we're climbing through here, if we fall, we want to go back there. It's just the easiest place that won't reset us to the beginning. Now, at the end of this big room, there's another room with spinning ruins, and I recommend that what you do is as you approach, try to get used to the timing for the very last platform that moves into the other room, as well as the ruin that's spinning that you can see through the windows. They are not on the same cycle, so if you just jump onto this last platform and hope things work, you can find yourself instantly falling off. So again, be slow, careful, deliberate, watch, learn, and jump when it's safe. You'll likely want to take this path on the right because it's pretty dense with platforms after the first couple of jumps, and I end up just sprinting through the right-hand side and panic jumping to the end. The next part is like the previous one, except it's vertical, which, if you learned anything before, this makes things much easier because, well, you can backtrack a little bit more safely. On top of that, there are some nice mushrooms here that bounce you up when you fall on them. You bounce higher off of them when you aren't gliding. However, I do want you to remember that if you glide bounce off of them, you can use that to change your momentum so you aren't flying in a direction you don't want to off of some of these later. So gliding into a mushroom can be a safe way to make sure that your momentum isn't carrying you in a bad direction. Big things to note. If you fall at the bottom of this vertical section, you're still going to make your way back to that little safe point A type area with all of the rocks going up. If you make it to the top or closer to the top, you can actually backtrack a little bit and try to land on lower platforms. This entire section, as we climb our way up, will sort of become our safe point B.5 because it's a backup for if we miss safe point B, which is a section that we're coming up to. And it's just the backup because it's a bit lower, so if you screw up some stuff, you can get back here with a little bit more time. And really, this is, again, all climbing and getting used to timing. That's all it is. So, good luck. The next section is a combination of ruins, climbing, horizontal, vertical platforms, and mushrooms. And I recommend taking things very slow and very deliberate here. If you're able to take some of these paths to the mushrooms, well, I recommend going to the left side when going through the walls rather than the right. And this is because the left side, the spinning rotation on the ruins will push you up rather than down, making it much easier to get through. This entire area is what I will call safe point B, and this is the one that you'll likely end up using the most throughout the rest of this run, unless you really screw up the ending. If you cannot reach this area safely when falling, immediately redirect to B.5 that we talked about before because it's a bit lower. Now, this is our first major asterisks of this, because when I ran this entire thing, I got sick of backtracking through this entire area and the next couple of zones just because. Went through it many times. There is a shortcut in this room which skips over all of those parts. If you're just looking to complete the entire run or get all of the chests in the area, which I won't specifically talk about here, you can try to find them on your own, you can do the skip to go over this wall, no problem. You can actually get to all of that stuff. Because I didn't do it and because I don't do it, I don't really have any tips for like the big roundabout section. So we'll be covering the skip and how to do that, get to the end. So sorry if you wanted some of that information. Now for the skip, after the first spinning ruin, you take this little hoverboard thing up, climb this wall, and you can rest by standing on top of the climby bits. And then you glide on this exact path to reach the end of part 2. Part 3 is likely the section that I found the hardest in the entire tower, mostly due to the glider and furniture not really getting along the best most of the time. Please remember that for almost this entire section, point B is our safe point. Now, when we're going through here, we have the spinning rocks, all of that, and I recommend using walk speed for the jumps at the beginning of this section, because, yeah, when the spinning rocks are about to be flat, we can jump on them and jump to the next piece of furniture, and I recommend looking for the next piece of furniture before you jump onto the spinning rock. Again, you don't want to be making decisions on the fly, you want to have a plan. I actually like going up the middle path here because I find it generally pretty safe. Once we reach the tub, you'll notice that there are 2 spinning rocks on either side, and for this, I actually do recommend switching to sprint, or if you want to keep using the walk speed, you'll have to use the glider. But basically, when these are about to be flat, we can jump onto the first, then jump onto the second, and glide to the mushroom. Once we hit the mushroom, we can get launched up, glide to the table, and then we do need to make a sprint run to the carpet. Now, after that, you have probably what I found was the worst part of this entire run to learn, for me personally. The furniture tower. For this, do not sprint. Take your time, plan your jumps, and just like before, if you have a spinning rock, always know where you're going to jump next. If you're on the lower sections of this furniture tower, point B is your safe point. Once you start getting a couple layers up, though, you can look down and try to plan furniture pieces that you think you can land on if you miss your jump. Once you get nearer to the top, there is this little mushroom outside of the window that you can jump to, and that'll launch you directly to the top, where there's another mushroom to launch you onto an upper platform. You can also climb the tower if you want to get practice with jumping, but just realize that this comes with the added risk of falling. Once you do reach the top platform, there are going to be some mushrooms that launch you out. These were previously bugged to send you back to the beginning of the entire thing, but that's fixed now, so you can now continue. I recommend after you launch off the mushrooms, once you get close to the next mushroom or section that you want to get to use your glider to reposition. Once you're done with this whole area, you'll see some spinning rocks and a spinning ruin. Because I'm me, I actually am going to tell you to not take the jump path over the rocks. Instead, once the spinning ruin passes, you can finish your climb up and run around the outside using your glider to make jumps. This is much safer because, as we learned earlier, falling internally into the tower will not allow us to get to any safe points. We'll just keep falling. Instead, if we fall on the outside, we can recover by taking this gliding path around, and you'll see that there's a mushroom on the side that we started with that will launch us back up. And once you get around all of this stuff, you're on to the final section. Part 4 is a random mix of pretty easy stuff and what I found to be pretty infuriating stuff, and that's really it. There's not really a whole lot to talk about here. I follow a pretty basic path through the ruins, although some of these jumps do actually require sprinting to make, so get used to that. And I honestly don't know what the safe point is for the start of this because I never fell there. I never really had to think of it. I recommend instead just taking your time and using your glider. About halfway through the ruins, you'll notice that there's a mushroom. That will be our safe point C, and I want you to remember it very well because it is a single mushroom in the middle of ruins. It's below everything, so you'll need to remember where it is at a moment's notice. So after a few more jumps, we're out of the ruins, we take some more jumps, and we're onto some pillars. For all of these pillars, if you think you're about to miss the jump, you need to immediately start your glide over to that safe point C. Time is important here because we're really not that much further up. So you need to get the direction and start moving immediately. Now, in order to make these jumps on the pillar, I recommend actually doing diagonal jumps. In order to complete these, you'll need to sprint and get pretty close to the edge before jumping, and then once you're at your max height, gliding onto the next pillar. And once you do this 4 times, you're good to go. And welcome to the final section, which is where I spent most of my time on my completion run. And it's honestly terrible. We have our platforms, horizontal and vertical, and for the first time, we see a platform that moves diagonally. Actually, there's a few of these in here. And the diagonal ones I found specifically really screwed up my timing for when to jump. Now, all of the platforms in this section, all the way until you beat this entire run, are on a perfect cycle. So this section is entirely about getting used to the timing and when to jump. If you're at the lower parts of this climb, I think point C is still your safe point. You're just gliding down a bit further. But once you get up a layer or two, you can land on the other platforms below you. Again, I recommend sprinting on the moving platforms just because it's easier to make the jump to the center. And once you get used to the timing of all of these jumps, you're basically at the end. So, good luck. And you'll just have to make a couple of sprint jumps right before the end. Good luck on your climbs. If you like this guide or any of the tips, please feel free to leave a follow. And if you do beat this, please tell me what was the hardest part for you, or what are you stuck on? You know, all of that stuff. Here are the people that make these videos possible, and thank you for watching.